Our next step is going to be the ceiling plans and working on the reflected ceiling plan view. So we're moving from the floor plan working to the reflected ceiling plan. And because the ceiling plans are usually cut at about 7.5 feet, you should be able to see your doors and your glazing that we placed at 8 feet. So it is going to capture it. So you can see where those are located. And as long as the detail level is set to coarse, you'll be able to see your wall types. So if you remember correctly or have a reference, you'll know which walls are supposed to sit underneath the ceiling and which walls are going to go through ceiling. Now let's talk a little bit about ceiling placement. So the ceiling command is in architecture tab and it's the ceiling option. And you have an option of automatic ceiling, which will try to automatically place it within the walls, or you can sketch ceiling. Now my suggestion is always to sketch your ceiling and place it exactly where you want it to go. Also, we'll start with a 2x4 compound ceiling system. Compound ceilings have multiple layers, so you can define your surface layer and then give it the grid up above, which is how we typically define most of the ceiling types. So here I know that the yellow walls are underneath the ceiling, so the ceiling will have to go up above them. And some of the other rooms, like the conference rooms, we have through ceiling, so those will not go all the way beyond the perimeter. So just placing a ceiling within this room is not going to work because that outside wall needs to be underneath the ceiling. So it needs to run beyond. Now, how far beyond and how do we place ceilings in the big open areas? And there are a few schools of thoughts. You could place the ceiling all the way to the edge of the window, so working with the boundary line, so working all the way in here. You could cut across and then put a soffit at the window, or you could even go beyond the columns and not engage them and have a gap at the perimeter. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go with this second option. And I'll just do the section that I'm working in. And at this point you can see that the exterior storefront changes and I don't have the same pocket type of gap, so I'm going to use that condition in order to stop my ceiling. And all of these walls are going through the grid, so I'm going to go around it. Now what I could do is keep running the ceiling all the way around, but the truth of the matter is I would probably have a break in my ceiling right here and it would not continue flowing in. So I generally try to draw it in Revit the same way it would be built in reality. So this is going to be my ceiling. And making sure that it's at 10 feet where I defined the top of that wall. Okay, so let's see what the ceiling looks like. So this is my 2x4 ceiling. I can play with the pattern later on. Now I want the same ceiling to go in here, and it's just going to have the little gap where the wall goes through it. So that's going to be my next round of ceiling. So in this particular case you can see that I did this whole section. I stopped it where the ceiling breaks, is broken by the wall, and then just went around these couple of walls here. Now I could continue it here, going across and joining with this ceiling over here. You can have fairly big expanses of ceiling, but think about where do you want your grid to be broken in reality, and then you can join it together. You do need to have a break in a grid for every 2500 square feet, so that's 2,500 square feet. So within your floor plate, you will definitely have a grid break somewhere. And also, if you're applying any kind of grid or any kind of treatment to the whole floor or most of the floor, please don't just pop it in and cover your core. Draw the ceiling where it would actually go. Your core is going to have the chipboard ceilings in the restrooms, and then the shafts, like the stairs and the open shafts, and the elevator shafts will not have a ceiling at all. So don't make a mistake of just applying one ceiling throughout. Okay, so let me finish the ceiling. And now I can look at this transition and use my align command to align one ceiling to the other. Now also think about your ceiling grid alignment. If you have corridor type of spaces like here, you would want to have either the grid or the full tile in the middle. And if you're running the lighting through the middle, in this case this is pretty wide, so I don't necessarily have to do that. There's probably some kind of seating or something in front of it. But if I wanted to do that, I could I would use the dimension command, pick my grid line, make it equal. So now the line is in the center. So because I want the tile in the center, I'm going to use the move command and move it over 2 feet, since the grid is 4 feet. There we go. Now what I'm getting here is I'm getting these ugly slivers. So in this particular case, I'm going to go back and have the line in the middle, which gives me the most full tiles as possible. And then I'm going to align my outer grid to it. And again here, see, I have the little sliver where my grid is broken. So I'm going to align my grid to break on the grid line and do the same with the other side. So think about these things, how you're building it when you're laying down your ceiling. Finally, there is the third option of what you can do. So here we have a full height wall, and you could do something special in this conference room. So what we could do with the ceiling is we could actually have a little gypsum board surround. So I'm going to offset this around by 2 feet in each direction. So now I have a gypsum board surround in the room. And then I'll put in a taller ceiling in the middle. And now you can see what's going on with the gypboard ceiling. It has a pattern on it. So here I'm going to go 6 inches up, because I know I can have a nice edge detail there. And again, thinking about, do I want a line or do I want a tile in the middle of the room? Now here I have a conference table underneath, so I know that I don't want a line in the middle because I might want to run some pendants there. So what I'm going to do is again select the line and move it by 1 foot. And now I have more full tiles, and I have a tile in the middle of the room in this direction. I could do it in the other direction, but I can see that my tiles would probably get really awkwardly shaped along the perimeter. So I'm going to leave it this way. Another more contemporary or industrial look, if you want to call it, would be to just have a floating ceiling in the middle of the room. So I'm going to select my gypboard ceiling, and now I have a floating ceiling here. However, in order to do this, I would need to make the surrounding walls full height, because now the 6 inches above, I would be able to talk above the wall. So again, think about the relationship between your walls and your ceilings. And I'm putting the gypboard here again, which is even further going to help the separation and sound not being transmitted between the rooms. So that much about ceiling design. Let's look at the ceiling types next. So now that I drew some of the ceilings, not the greatest, but something that's a fairly standard ceiling plan, and note that all of the ceilings within the individual rooms are separate because wherever the wall goes through the ceiling. One thing you want to check after you're done with the ceilings is if there is something related to the wall height that you need to change. So for example, right here I decided I'm going to leave this area exposed and have some clouds. Well, in that case, I need a new wall type around this perimeter to make it a full height wall type. Which is why it's important to be looking at your wall types. So I'm going to make a break in a wall here. Now the rest of this is just through ceiling, so there is no reason to run it all the way up. But I'm going to go a little bit beyond the border because you can remember you might have also an angled view line above this edge of the ceiling, and then it's a further discussion how do you treat the edge of the ceiling. But I know that this becomes a new wall type, and because I have glazing in it, that would be a new wall type as well. And I need this to be full height. So I'm editing it, duplicating. So keep in mind you might need to go back and forth as you develop this. So this is my type 8. And this is full height. I'm changing the color. I'm not changing the structure in any way. Make this a purple. This is just a message about my curtain walls that are not embedded yet. And then I'm adjusting the height to the underside of the deck, which is just above 13 feet in my particular case. Now you could do it floor to floor, but keep in mind there's the thickness of the floor, so you want to hit a full height wall to the underside of the deck, for which you need to know what the thickness of your deck is. And if the whole building is modeled, which typically it is going to be when you're working on a shell and clutter project, and this is how you would be doing it. So we have 2 new wall types, just like that. So let's look at what we might want to do with some of these ceilings. So 2x4 and the same ceiling in the office and the outside. We can probably create just a generic ceiling type. But maybe in a conference rooms we want to do something with a little bit more absorption, especially if I don't have much going on the walls. So I'm going to select one of these ceilings and edit type. Now because I didn't take the step to define my type 1, the general type, this one I'm just going to start with the type 2. I'll go back to type 1. I'm going to make this 2x2 because the rooms are fairly square, so 2x2 acoustic ceiling tile, and we can define the grid, or maybe the grid is the same throughout, and this one is going to be high NRC, high CAC. So it's going to prevent the transmission, and it's also going to be a more absorptive ceiling. In the open areas we only usually use high NRC because there is not necessarily a transmission issue. And 2x2 we're going to give it a different pattern, so we will not need to do anything with the color or anything special. Oh, and keep in mind the core scale fill pattern that we use for walls, that only works for cut surfaces. So when we're looking at things in plan, like ceilings and floors, we need to apply any color in the structure. So the structure default, this is your suspension system, and you could note it as suspension system. Here we have finish, acoustical tile, 5/8, 3/4 up to an inch, 5 1/2 inch to 5/8 is actually pretty common for this, but we want to have a 2x2. Okay, so interior acoustic ceiling tile, and this one, let's look at the full name. So this is 24x48, so I'm going to just duplicate that one because I want most category things to stay the same, and I'm going to make it 24x24. Okay, so I have the name, and now I need to change the pattern here. So thankfully I have a 24x24 ceiling already predefined. Next step, we're going to look how to define size that we don't have in here. So for example, we don't have 48x48. Actually, I do have 48x48. We'll do something custom. You can see here that different overhead slats and different things have been defined. Okay, so now I have a 2x2 ceiling, and I'm going to select all of the small conference room ceilings, and change it to the type 2. Now I'm going to take the 2x4 and edit type, and I'm going to duplicate this. So this I'm going to define as our type 1. So this is a 2x4, and this is just going to be high NRC. I'm assuming all my ceilings are white. If I have a specific color like a black ceiling, I would define that here. Usually by default most of these are white, so I am not calling it out here where I have limited space. You would call it out in your outline spec. Okay, so now I want to make sure that all of these are noted as type 1. Now I probably don't want this to be just my standard type 1 ceiling. I might want to have it also be a 2x2. I might want to have it be something special. So let's actually say I'm going to make this a 2x2, but I'm also going to assign something else to it to change the color of it. So I'm going to edit type, duplicate, and call this my type 3. This is a 2x. Actually, let's look at doing some special size. So the room is fairly small. Let's make this a wood tile. So 2x2, wood. Still going to be acoustical ceiling tile, and we cannot really do a very high NRC here, so this is going to be more for looks. Now, wall heights are defined by wall type. Ceiling heights will be defined independently, so that's why we're not noting that. But here in my finish, I'll need to create a new finish. Okay, so I'm gonna start with 2x2, and I'm going to duplicate it. And now what I'm going to do next is I'm going to apply some color, so this one is going to stand out. Now I could work and have a different pattern, making sure that I call this wood. My rendering look appearance will be adjusted for any type of renderings because this is the wood ceiling, and I'll probably import something, but in the meanwhile I just want to make sure that it looks a little bit different here. So what I'm going to do, actually you could do this with color, or you could apply a secondary pattern to it. So I'm using a drafting pattern here, and I'm just gonna apply a diagonal pattern to the back of it. Okay, let's see what that is going to look like. So now we have our 2x2 ceiling, which is showing us the grid, and I'm applying an additional pattern to define the ceiling. Now, if you have a lot of 2x2s or a lot of 2x4s and you're running out of patterns, you could do this by applying a color as well and color coding it. However, usually with ceilings, we will stick to just the patterns. There is usually sufficient patterning, and whenever we're working with the grid, we are working with some kind of a pattern. So I'm going to leave this here, but just in the same way that I adjusted the pattern, I could have adjusted the color of the pattern and made this wall, the ceiling, for example, a red type of a ceiling. So this is how you define different ceiling types, and you'll probably have one very generalized one for the exterior spaces, one generalized one for all of your enclosed spaces, and then a few specialty ceilings, clouds, wood ceilings, special applications. And I wanted to briefly address what to do about the exposed ceiling. One school of thought is just leaving it like this as white, and then our gibboard ceiling, which, don't forget, is a special ceiling type. So that would be our ceiling type 4. So that's type 4. And that's gibboard. And it can be suspended. This is just a flat ceiling, so it's not compound, and it does not have a multi-layered structure. And sometimes we have pattern on it, sometimes we leave that white. Generally in the ceilings, anything that looks white looks like we forgot about it. So what I like to use for exposed ceiling, and I'm assuming that this whole corner of the building is going to be exposed, I like to create a ceiling type that's not a ceiling, that denotes the area where we don't have a ceiling, and give it a color. So I'm going to create a new ceiling. And now, because this is going above, I could sketch right above some of these dropped ceilings, right? It's going all the way through. But keep in mind, it's not going through the outside enclosure. It's not going to go through the core of your building. Especially, it's not going to be going through the shafts. So, yes, you could cover some of the areas, and I'm going to stop it right here. Even though it could technically continue beyond. So I'm going to go above some of the ceiling, but I'm not going to go through stair and elevators, for example, if I was running it beyond. Now I'm just doing this corner because I'm trying to demonstrate how to do this. So I'm going to actually start with the gibboard. It's just a basic ceiling, and I'm going to edit type here and duplicate. It has just one material. And I'm just going to call this exposed deck. And you could have duct lining or some kind of acoustic treatment. I could note that here. I will note this as a separate ceiling type, so I have that option. But because it's not by default a ceiling, you could just call it the exposed deck. I'm gonna have it as my type 5, just to leave an option. So I can do exposed deck with acoustic liner. And now I need to select a finish here. So I could select something pre-done. I actually like to go to the default options. So you say you have default floor, default ceiling, default wall. You actually don't have the default ceiling, but the default floor usually has a gray pattern. So I'm going to duplicate the floor, since they're very similar to ceilings, and do this as post deck. And not give it a foreground pattern or anything, but just make a solid fill and a gray. Not too dark of a gray, not too light, just something that's going to print. And by putting it in the background, I'll be able to see any of the steel members that might be exposed. Okay, so you see it's gray. And depending on the level of detail, so if I increase the level of detail to medium, you see that I have some steel members here. So I should be able to still see those steel members even beyond the deck. And even though I went on top of the ceiling, because this is what's going on top of everything, because the ceiling is below, whatever is below is going to be covering your higher layers. So as you're defining the different heights, because this is actually, it should be at 13.6, so it's higher above. Also the compound ceilings, because they protrude more, they are going to also be layered below the basic ceilings. So this is how we should treat our exposed deck. If you have any exposed deck areas, think about how you're treating them acoustically. Think about if at the minimum you're painting them, you want to cover them in white or dark gray. Sometimes we do black. So think about you're treating it and make sure you define it specifically on your ceiling type plan. I wanted to take the ceiling discussion as an opportunity to discuss hatches or the ceiling patterns and in general filled region patterns in Revit. As you could see in the file that I already have different predefined ceiling types. You might need to define them individually in order to apply individual pattern to the material. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to just do a little tutorial on the patterns and go to the Manage tab. Now different materials then have patterns assigned to them. Keep in mind that those are independent. You're assigning a pattern that's predefined under the fill pattern, and you can assign it to the material. So the same pattern can be assigned to multiple materials. If you change it under one material, you change it in all of the occurrences. So it's important to disassociate those two. We talked about this briefly earlier on in the preparatory classes for Revit, but again, if you change pattern, if you change a text type, if you change something like that without duplicating in one place, you will change it globally. So let's go and look at the fill patterns. Here you can see all of the fill patterns, all of the drafting fill patterns always come up to in the same scale. They're not scaled to the reality. They're just different hatches, literally. Even fancy things you could put on a ceiling. Now, model patterns are follow the three-dimensional model scaling, so they're going to be scaled to the size of the model. Our ceiling patterns, anytime we want to actually show a grid or a flooring layout, we would be using a model pattern. And all of these, even though some of them look like standard hatches, they do have an actual three-dimensional size. So how are these defined? Let's look at a simple one. So one by one tile. I'm going to go to Edit. It's just it has a name. It's a basic type, and anything with parallel lines or a crosshatch, you can define the spacing and define the angle, and you can create your own custom without much problem. So I'm not going to modify this, and again, you would always create a new one, a new fill pattern if you're doing something custom. Now, something like this, it looks like a very customized pattern. It probably came with something that was imported, and if I go and edit that, that is a custom pattern. And custom patterns are defined through an external file, and this one, by the DWG to it, it looks like it originally came from AutoCAD. Now, what are these custom pattern files? Let's look at the Revit custom pattern file. And then I'm going to show you how to actually customize one of these more complex patterns, just briefly. So, where this pattern file is located for Revit is on your local disk under Program Files, Autodesk, your Revit version, and under Data, and it's a PAT file. And this is what it looks like. So I pulled it up to our parquet. So this is a particular type of a flooring that's 6 inches, and there is only one size, one scale of it, and this is defined as model. Some of the patterns are drafting, as you can see, the other ones are model, and the numbers define the spacing, the starting and the ending points of the lines, and more lines that are more complex the pattern is. So you can tell that this one is a little bit more complicated. A few of these are simple, probably simple triangular grids, and then you'll run into things like gravel that are really, really complicated. Now, anything that is already in this file is predefined within the Revit file. It's a pattern that you can grab. But you can create your own copy. I also wanted to note that you can use the AutoCAD PAT file, and that one is located in a different place. So also Program Files, Autodesk, AutoCAD, but it's User Data Cache in US, and it's under Support, not under Data there. And to look at that file, so that one defines it as AutoCAD, and it has all of the, so that's their parquet flooring. It has a different pattern that's 12 by 12. So you could, if you memorize the name of it and link up this file, you could get another parquet pattern. So let's go back to our Revit file, and let's say I want to create a new fill pattern. Just going to call it P for now. If I use custom, I can browse and go to my AutoCAD file. Let's create this file. There are no modern type patterns found, so that parquet pattern that's in there that says it's 12 inches, it's actually not scaled to model, and you cannot use it as a model. So this option would not work. I could, however, create a drafting pattern out of that AutoCAD file. Now what I can do, let's get rid of the AutoCAD one, can go here and I can save as and make a different size parquet pattern. So I did exactly that, and what I did is I made a 8-inch from the 6-inch. So looking at the original file, this one just has a 6-inch, so this one is customized. The only thing is you'll need to save this somewhere else. You cannot override the existing one in the Autodesk file, but you can save it in your project folder file and create some custom patterns. Okay, so it's the number 8, and let me show you what the difference here is. So again, I'm going to create a new one, and I'm going to browse, and now I'm going to go to that custom file that I saved. And it's giving me all of the options, so a lot of these are already in existence, like the 6-inch parquet that was already loaded in. Few things I could do. I could just use a pattern that's already there and change the scale of it. So if I make it double the scale, you see it change the size. If I make it half of the scale, it's smaller. But what I did is I changed the pattern slightly. So you can see here there's a bigger gap in the middle, and then I can also play with the scale of that. So you can customize your own patterns. Now, how do you deal with that custom file, and what do all of the lines mean? That's a much longer tutorial and a much longer discussion. So for that, I would suggest a website. So the Revit Kit blog, I know it's a silly name, I did actually follow this blog for a while, and it has one of the better tutorials that explains how to create your custom PAT files. It explains what each line is in plain English, and it gives you enough information if you ever wanted to create, for example, a custom herringbone pattern for your carpet, something I've done before. It will take a little while, but it allows you to fully customize what you're trying to create in a model pattern in Revit. So it is a fairly old tutorial, but it's still, again, the PAT files still work the same way. That's just an old-fashioned text file. And he does have a video as well. So the Revit Kit, and just looking for Revit tutorial on creating and modifying surface patterns. So back in my own Revit file, I'm going to create this custom parquet, and I'm going to import it at the full scale. And now I have a new pattern in a library. So what I could do is, if I wanted to change one of my ceiling patterns, go into the structure, I could go into the finish, and now in here, under the malum pattern, I'm going to have an option of that new pattern that I just created, which is, you can see right here, it is really complex, so it's not something I'm going to keep, but just so you know, this is something you can do yourself. And the last step of the ceiling type exercise is to create a legend. As always, make sure the scale matches the scale of your drawing, as it's going to appear on the sheet. Now, one thing we cannot do here is, with a lot of things, we can use legend components. However, if you navigate to the ceilings, unfortunately, only show up in a section, which is no use to us. So what you need to use here is the filled region command. So that's also in the Annotate tab, and we're going to use the filled region. We're going to create a rectangle. So we're going to start with our type 1. And you want to, like with the walls, you probably want to do at least 6 feet. A lot of times we make these fairly square. Rectangle 6 by 4 is probably good. Let's see how that is going to work with our standard text. So finishing the command. Don't forget filled region, it's a multi-step command. And let's see. So this is ceiling type 1. This is obviously incorrect pattern. So I'm going to have to make a custom pattern here for the filled region. Now we have the pattern already in a file. But what we have to do is don't override anything. We're going to duplicate this. And you can call it ceiling type 1, or you can call it by the pattern name. So the pattern name is 24 inch by 48 inch acoustical ceiling tile. And I usually prefer to call filled region patterns not by the type I'm assigning it to, because I could change my mind on that, but by what it actually is. Okay, and now here we can go to the mallow patterns and look for our 2x4. And like on the actual ceiling plan, you can adjust the location of the lines by picking the individual line. You do this by using the tab command and setting it up so it's centered in whatever the filled region size you decided on. Now, once you set up the filled region size, make sure you size it based on your largest tile. So if you have a really large tile like a 4x4, you'll need a bigger section in this because a 4x4 wouldn't be fully visible. So size your rectangle partially based on your largest pattern, and then keep the same size for all of the types. So let me set it up and show you what that might look like. So a couple of things I wanted to remind you. The exposed deck was just a solid filled region with a gray color, so make sure you define it as that. Chipboard pattern for the ceiling type 4, and 3, remember we had a compound pattern, so I'm going to edit type, and I'm going to duplicate here, and this is going to be wood, because I don't want to override the other 2x2. And then as a background fill pattern, I'm going to apply the same pattern that I had on my ceiling plan. And this is my ceiling type legend, and that was all on the ceiling types.